The night his father died, Marcus Hale sat alone in an office that overlooked half the city, and he felt nothing he could name. The towers below him blinked in the cold. 41 floors of a company his father had built from a single hardware store, and now it was his. All of it, the contracts and the holdings and the $4 billion that had a way of making people lower their voices when they said his name. He had buried his father that afternoon under a grey sky, beside a marble headstone with 2 dates and a single line. He had shaken 300 hands. He had said thank you until the word stopped meaning anything. And now he sat in the dark and waited to feel like a son who had lost his father, and the feeling did not come. Because his father had been a stranger to him for most of his life, a man who lived behind a closed door and a colder voice, and you cannot grieve a door. What he did not know yet was that the man behind that door had left him something, not money. The money was already his, signed and notarized and explained by lawyers in a room that smelled of leather and old paper. This was smaller than money. It was one envelope, yellowed at the edges, tucked into the back of a drawer in a desk that no one had opened in years. And inside that envelope was a letter that would take everything Marcus believed about his father, about his fortune, about the kind of man he himself had become, and turn it over like a stone, exposing the soft, dark earth beneath. That night he knew none of it. He knew only the silence and the city and the weight of a name that now belonged only to him. His father, Walter Hale, had been a hard man to love. Marcus had spent 36 years learning that. As a boy he had watched his father leave before dawn and return after dark, a man made of work who measured affection in tuition checks and stiff handshakes and the occasional clap on the shoulder that landed like a verdict. Walter did not say he was proud. Walter said, "Do better." When Marcus graduated at the top of his class, his father read the diploma, set it down, and asked what came next. When Marcus closed his first major deal, 26 years old, and shaking with it, his father nodded once and said the margins could have been tighter. There had been a softness in him once. Marcus had been told, back when Marcus's mother was alive. She had died when Marcus was 9, though, and whatever warmth had lived in his father seemed to have been buried with her. And the man who raised the boy after that was all edges. So Marcus became edges too. He learned it the way children learn the language spoken in their house. By 41 he ran the company the way his father had run it, with a steady hand and a closed face, and people respected him and feared him in roughly equal measure, and almost no one loved him, and he had told himself for a long time that this was simply the cost of doing the thing well. Love was for people with less to protect. His father had taught him that without ever saying it, and Marcus had been a good student. He stayed in the office until nearly 2 in the morning. Then, because he could not sleep and could not sit still, he drove to his father's house. Big stone house on the hill where Marcus had grown up cold. The housekeeper had gone home. The rooms held their breath. He walked through them the way you walk through a museum of your own life, past the staircase he had run down on Christmas mornings that always felt slightly hollow, past the dining room where dinners had been eaten in silence, and he ended up, without quite meaning to, in his father's study. It was exactly as Walter had left it, the heavy desk, the wall of books no one had read, the single photograph of Marcus's mother turned at an angle that suggested it was looked at often, which surprised him because Walter had almost never spoken her name. Marcus sat down in his father's chair for the first time in his life. He did not know what he was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the shape of the man, some residue, some clue to the question he had carried his whole life without ever asking it aloud, which was simply, "Who were you, and why could you never reach me?" He opened the drawers one by one. Pens, old checkbooks, a magnifying glass, and then in the bottom drawer, behind a false panel that his fingers found by accident, an envelope. It was thick and soft with age. On the front, in his father's hard square handwriting, were 2 words. For Marcus. His hands were not steady when he opened it. Inside were several pages, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone white. He began to read, and the first line stopped his breath in his chest. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I have run out of time to tell you the truth I should have told you while I could still see your face." Marcus read the whole letter once, fast, the way you read something you are afraid of. Then he read it again, slowly. And the second time he understood that the man he had spent his life resenting was not the man who had lived. The letter told a story Marcus had never heard. 40 years ago, before the company, before the money, Walter had been nobody. A young man with a failing hardware store, and a wife who was pregnant and sick, and bills he could not pay, and a winter coming. The store was 3 months from closing. The bank had stopped returning his calls. And one freezing February, with his wife in the hospital and his accounts empty, Walter had stood in the back room of his little store and decided he was going to do something he could never undo. He was going to walk away from all of it. He had written a different letter that night, a letter to his unborn child explaining why his father would not be there, and he had meant every terrible word of it. He did not walk away, though, because of a woman named Dorothy Pearl. Marcus had never heard the name. He read it 3 times. Dorothy Pearl. The letter went on. She had run the diner 2 doors down from Walter's store, a small place with red vinyl booths and a coffee pot that was always half full, and for 2 years she had watched the young man from the hardware store come in every morning, order the cheapest thing on the menu and count out his coins like they were the last he had, because they often were. She never said anything about it. She just started bringing him more than he ordered, an extra egg, a second slice of toast, once a whole bowl of soup he had not asked for, set down in front of him with the words, "Kitchen made too much, you would be doing me a favor." He knew it was not true. There was no too much in a kitchen like hers. A kitchen that fed its owner last, where the margins were thin enough to see daylight through. He let her tell the lie because the lie let him keep his dignity, and his dignity was the only thing he had left. And Dorothy understood that the way some people understand music, by ear, without ever having to be taught. A man with nothing in his pockets can still be a man if you do not make him beg for the egg. She had learned that lesson somewhere herself. The letter guessed in a life that had clearly not been easy, and she had decided to spend the rest of her days making sure no one else had to learn it the hard way. And on the worst night of his life, the February night, he had decided to disappear. Walter had gone into that diner one last time to be somewhere warm and lit before he did the thing he had planned. The snow was coming down outside in slow, heavy flakes. The store behind him was dark, and the bank was closed, and the hospital had his wife in a bed he could not pay for, and he had come to the diner because it was the only place left in the world that had ever been kind to him, and he wanted one more cup of coffee in the warm before the cold took the rest. Dorothy saw his face. She had seen 1,000 faces across that counter, and she knew the difference between a man who was tired and a man who was finished, and Walter that night was a man who was finished. She did not ask what was wrong. She poured him coffee and she sat down across from him, which she had never done in 2 years, and she told him a thing he wrote down word for word in the letter so his son would have it. She said, "I do not know what you are carrying, but I know the look of a man who is about to set down something he should keep holding. Whatever it is, it can wait until morning. Almost everything can." And then she did the thing that saved his life. She took an envelope out of her apron, the diner's whole week of tips, the money that was supposed to cover her own rent, and she pushed it across the table, and she said, "This is a loan, not a gift, because I expect to see you become someone, and you cannot pay me back if you are gone." It was $312. Walter counted it later. $312 from a woman who did not have it to give. On the night he had decided to leave his unborn son fatherless, he went home. He did not disappear. The next morning he opened his store, and the morning after that, and somehow the store survived the winter, and the next year it survived too, and slowly, across decades, that one hardware store became 2, and then a chain, and then a holding company, and then an empire, and Walter Hale became one of the richest men in the state. And the boy who had nearly been abandoned grew up in a stone house on a hill, cold, well-fed, and loved as much as a hardened man knew how to love, which was not enough, but which was something, and which only existed at all because of $312 and a woman who would not let a stranger give up. Marcus set the letter down. The study was very quiet. He understood now why his father had been the way he was, a man crushed flat by how close he had come to ruin, a man who could never again let himself feel. the kind of fear he had felt that winter and so had armored over every soft place, including the one where his son was supposed to live. It did not excuse it. It explained it, though, and there was more. The last page of the letter was different. The handwriting was shakier, written later, perhaps near the end. Walter wrote that he had tried for 40 years to find her. He had gone back to the diner once he had money, and it was gone, sold. The building turned into something else. He had hired people. He had searched. He had wanted, more than he had ever wanted any deal, to put into her hands a return on her loan that matched what it had bought, which was everything. He never found her. And so the last thing the letter asked, the only thing Walter ever asked of his son, was this: find her, or find what became of her, and pay the debt I could not pay, not because she asked, because we owe it, and a debt unpaid is a kind of theft, and I did not raise you to be a thief. Marcus sat in his father's chair until the sky outside went from black to grey. Something in him had come loose. For the first time since he was 9 years old, he wept, and he could not have said exactly for what, for his father, for himself, for a woman who had set down a week of her own survival in front of a stranger and asked for nothing but that he live. When the morning came, he did not go to the office. He made one phone call to cancel everything, and then he began. It is a strange thing to be a man who can buy almost anything and to discover that the one thing you need cannot be bought. Marcus had assumed that first morning that money would make the search quick. He was wrong. The diner had closed 31 years ago. The records were thin. The name was common enough in a city of that size, and the woman he was looking for would be old now, in her 80s at least, if she was alive at all. And the further he looked, the more he understood she might not be. He hired an investigator, a quiet, careful woman named Renee Coleman, who had spent 20 years finding people who did not want to be found, and on their first meeting she told him the truth he needed to hear, which was that he should prepare himself, because most searches like this one ended at a grave. Renee worked for 3 weeks before she found the first real thread. She did it the old way because the new way did not work on a woman who had spent 30 years off the grid. He drove to the county building and sat in a basement with boxes of microfiche. She knocked on doors in a neighborhood that had changed 3 times since Dorothy lived there. She bought coffee for retired social workers and let them talk. And slowly the shape of a life came up out of the records like a photograph in a tray of developer. Dorothy had sold the diner and used the money to do something nobody who had known her was surprised by. She had taken in foster children. Not 1 or 2, over the years more than 30. She had run a home that the county case workers spoke of in tones usually reserved for saints, a place where the children nobody wanted went and somehow became children somebody loved. Renee found a woman now grown who had lived in that house at the age of 7, and the woman cried on the phone when Dorothy's name was spoken, and she said, "That woman is the reason I am alive, you understand. She found me eating out of a gas station trash can, and she took me home, and she never once made me feel like a stray." And Marcus did understand. Better than he had understood almost anything, because he was sitting in a stone house bought with the same currency, which was a kindness given to someone who could not pay it back. The thread went cold after that, though. Dorothy had grown old. The foster home had closed when she could no longer run it, the year she turned 76, when her own body stopped being something she could lean on. And then she had simply slipped out of the records the way the poor and the old so often do. No property in her name, no business, nothing for the system to track. Renee pushed. She found a hospital admission from 4 years back. A fall, a broken hip. She found a discharge to a facility, and then a transfer, and then another, each one cheaper than the last, each one farther from the part of the city where anyone had ever known her name. And then the trail thinned to almost nothing. There were nights Marcus nearly gave up. He would sit in his father's study with the letter in his hand and feel the old voice in him, the voice his father had given him, saying it was a sentimental errand, that he was a serious man with serious things to do, that a man does not upend a $4 billion enterprise to chase the ghost of a diner owner across 30 years of paperwork. And then he would read the line again. A debt unpaid is a kind of theft. And he would tell Renee to keep going and write whatever, check the next stretch of looking required. And he noticed somewhere in those weeks that for the first time in his life, he was spending money on something that would never appear on a balance sheet, and that it felt less like losing it and more like finally using it for the thing it was for. She found her in the spring. Dorothy was alive. She was 87 years old, and she was living in a state-funded nursing home on the east side of the city in a shared room with no family listed, no visitors logged in over a year, and a balance owed to the facility that the county was in the process of using to justify moving her somewhere cheaper and farther away. Renee called him at 6 in the morning to tell him. Marcus did not speak for a long moment. Then he asked one question. Is she lucid? And Renee said, the staff says she has good days and bad ones, but yes, she knows where she is and she knows who she is. He said he would go that day. Renee said, before you do, there is one more thing you should know, and Marcus heard something in her voice he had not heard before. The facility she is in, Renee said, is on land your company bought 18 months ago. You own the building she is being evicted from. Marcus drove to the east side himself. He did not bring lawyers or assistants. He had spent his life arriving places in a way designed to make people nervous. A black car and a man who walked in already knowing he would win, and he did not want that, not here. He parked his plain rental car in a lot with cracked asphalt and weeds coming up through the seams, and he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel because he found he was afraid, and he could not remember the last time he had been afraid of anything that did not involve money. Then he walked into a building that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, and something underneath both that he did not want to name, and he gave a name at the desk, not his own, just Dorothy's, and a tired aide with kind eyes and a lanyard pointed him down a hallway lit by the kind of light that makes everyone look ill. The walls were hung with faded prints of flowers. A television played to no one in a common room where 3 residents sat far apart, each alone. He found her room. The door was open, and there, in a narrow bed by a window that looked out on a parking lot, was a small woman with white hair and folded hands, awake, watching the door, as if she had been waiting a very long time for anyone to walk through it. He did not know how to begin. He stood in the doorway, a billionaire who had negotiated against governments and walked out with what he came for, and he could not find a single word. There was a plastic cup of water on the tray beside her and a Bible worn soft at the spine, and nothing else, no cards, no photographs, no flowers, none of the small evidence that someone in the world is thinking of you. Dorothy looked at him with eyes that were cloudy but not dim, and she said, in a voice worn thin but steady, "You are not one of the regular ones. Are you lost?" And Marcus, to his own surprise, said, "I think I have been, for a very long time. May I sit?" She gestured to the plastic chair beside the bed, and he sat, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the parking lot baked in the sun outside the window, and a bus sighed past somewhere below. He told her his name. It meant nothing to her. Then he told her his father's name, Walter, and he watched something move across her face, a long way down, like a stone dropping into a deep well. And after a moment she said, "The boy from the hardware store." Marcus's throat closed. "You remember him," he managed. Dorothy smiled, and most of her teeth were gone, and it was the warmest thing Marcus had seen in years. "I remember everyone who sat at my counter looking like the world was ending," she said. "There were a lot of them. Him I remember, because he came back though. Most of them I never saw again. He came back the next morning, and he ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, same as always, and he tried to give me back the money, and I would not take it, because a person who is trying to give the money back the next morning is a person who is going to be all right." She paused. "He was all right then. I always wondered." Marcus took the letter out of his coat. His hands were shaking again, the way they had shaken the night he found it. He said he was more than all right. And then he told her. He told her about the store that survived the winter, and the second store, and the chain, and the company, and the $4 billion, and the stone house on the hill, and the boy who grew up in it, who was sitting beside her now. He watched her understand it slowly, the enormity of what her $312 had grown into, and he braced for her to be astonished, to weep, to grasp the size of it. She did none of those things. She listened to the whole story of the empire her kindness had built, and when he was done, the only thing Dorothy wanted to know was whether the young man from the hardware store had been happy, whether his wife had lived, whether the baby had been born healthy. The money did not interest her at all, only the people. He had to tell her that his mother had died young, and Dorothy closed her eyes at that and was quiet, and a tear ran down into the deep lines of her face for a woman she had never met who had been a stranger's pregnant wife 40 years ago. Then he read her the letter, all of it, his father's hard, square handwriting, in his own voice, the confession of the February night, the loan, the words she had said that he had written down and carried for 40 years. When Marcus read the line where his father called the $312 the best investment ever made in the history of the company, Dorothy laughed a small, dry laugh, and she said, "I only ever made the one." And then he read her the last page, the shaky page, the part where his father wrote that he had searched for her for 40 years and failed, and that he was sorry, and that he had asked his son to find her and pay a debt he could not pay. And the room was very quiet when he finished. Dorothy looked out the window at the parking lot for a long time. Then she said the thing Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "Tell him it was never a debt. Tell him I was paid the moment he came back the next morning." And Marcus had to say, gently, that he could not tell his father anything anymore, and Dorothy reached over and put her papery hand on top of his, the way you comfort a child, and she said, "Then I will tell you, and you can carry it for him. It was never a debt. Do not owe me anything. You have come, though, and that is the whole of what I wanted, which was only to know how the story ended." Marcus stayed the whole afternoon. He learned that she had eaten alone every meal for a year. He learned the facility was moving her in 11 days to a place 90 miles away, where the rooms were cheaper and she would know no one and never go home. Because home for the very old and the very poor is wherever the math allows. He learned all of this in her plain, uncomplaining voice, a woman stating the weather. And something hardened in Marcus that afternoon, but it was not the old hardness, the armored kind his father had given him. It was the other kind, the kind that is really a decision. He did not move her 90 miles away. He bought the nursing home. Not the room, not the bill, the whole facility in 3 days, through the same company that had owned the land beneath it all along. And the first thing he did as its owner was stop every transfer and cancel every eviction on every floor. And the second thing he did was sit down with the staff and ask them what they would do if money were not the reason they could not do it. And then he funded the list. That was the small part, though, the part money could do, and Marcus had learned by then that money was the small part. The large part was that he came back. Every week, and then twice a week, a man worth $4 billion sat in a plastic chair beside the bed of a woman who had once fed his father an extra egg because the kitchen made too much, and he listened to her, and he let her tell him about the more than 30 children she had raised, the ones who had turned out well, and the 1 or 2 who had broken her heart, and the ones she still prayed for by name. Though she had not seen them in decades, she remembered all of them. She told him about a boy who would not speak for the first 3 months and then would not stop, and a girl who hid food under her mattress until she trusted that the next meal was coming, and how you do not cure that. With a lecture, you cure it with breakfast every morning until the body learns it is safe. Marcus, who had grown up never wondering where his next meal was coming from and had still grown up hungry in a way he was only now naming, listened to all of it, and slowly, in a way he could not have explained to anyone at the office, the cold place inside him, where a son was supposed to live, began, after 32 years, to thaw. He brought her things on his visits, small things, a soft blanket, a radio that played the gospel station she liked, a plant for the windowsill that she fussed over, and that he watered when she could not. He learned that she took her coffee with too much cream. He learned that she had never married, that the children had been her whole family, that she did not consider this a sacrifice, and was puzzled when anyone called it one. The aide with the kind eyes told him one afternoon in the hall that Dorothy talked about him after he left, that she called him "my new one," the way she had once talked about the children who came to her late and scared. And Marcus had to stand at the window at the end of the hall for a minute before he could drive home. He found the foster children. That became the work of the next months, and it was Renee who did most of it, the same quiet woman who had found Dorothy, now finding the children Dorothy had saved, who were grown and scattered across the country. Nurses and mechanics and teachers and a pastor and one man who had spent 10 years in prison and come out and turned his life around and never forgotten the woman who had loved him at 9. Marcus called them all himself. He had assumed it would be a duty, a list to work through, and instead it became the part of his day he waited for. There was a nurse in Atlanta who had to set the phone down when he told her Dorothy was alive, and he heard her crying through the speaker. And when she came back, she said she had named her own daughter after Dorothy and had always meant to find her and had always been too afraid the answer would be a grave. There was a mechanic outside Memphis who did not say much, who just kept saying, "She's still here, she's still here," like a man steadying himself on a railing. The man who had been to prison wept and said he had spent 10 years writing her letters. He never had an address to send and asked if he could bring them. And the thing that happened then was the thing Marcus had not known to hope for. They came. One by one, and then in groups, they came back to the woman who had raised them the way Walter had come back the next morning, getting in cars and on buses and on a plane or two, taking days off from jobs that did not give days off, because some debts a person is glad to be asked to pay. Dorothy, who had eaten alone for a year, spent the last spring of her life in a room that was never empty, surrounded by the people she had given her one ordinary, world-altering gift, to which was the refusal to let a child go unloved. The man from Memphis brought his tools and fixed every squeaking wheelchair on the floor. The nurse from Atlanta read to her in the afternoons. The pastor held a small service at the bedside one Sunday, and half the staff came, and Dorothy, propped up on pillows, sang along to a hymn in a voice that had almost no breath left in it, but knew every word. She died in June on a warm afternoon with the window open and a breeze moving the curtain and 4 of her children in the room and Marcus in the plastic chair holding her hand. She was not afraid. She had told him the week before that she had made her peace a long time ago, that a life spent feeding people who were hungry leaves a person very little to regret, and that the only thing she had ever truly wanted at the end was to not finish it alone, and that he had seen to that, and so she was content. Near the end, on one of her clear days, she had asked Marcus to bring her something, and he had not understood the request until he did it. She asked him to bring her a cup of coffee from the kind of diner she used to run, a real one, in a paper cup with too much cream. He drove across the city looking for it, past 3 places that were too new and too bright, until he found a narrow old diner with red vinyl booths going grey at the seams, and a coffee pot that was always half full, a place that could have been hers 40 years ago, and he stood at the counter while a waitress poured it. And he tipped her in a way that made her look up, and he carried the cup back across the city, like it was the most fragile thing he had ever held. Dorothy took it in both hands and smelled it, and did not drink much of it, and she closed her eyes, and she said, "This is the smell of my whole life," and she smiled. That was 2 days before the end. On the last afternoon she drifted in and out, and in one of the clear moments she looked at Marcus and seemed for a second to see his father in him, and she said, "You came back," and he did not correct her, because in every way that mattered, it was true. At her funeral there were more than 100 people, and almost none of them were rich, and Marcus stood at the back and listened to a pastor who had been one of her children describe a woman who had given everything she had her entire life, and had owned, at the time of her death, almost nothing, and had been, by every measure that the pastor said actually counted, one of the wealthiest people any of them would ever know. Marcus thought about his father's letter, the line about the best investment in the history of the company. He understood it differently now. The return on her $312 was not the $4 billion. The $4 billion was just money. The return was the room full of people who had come back. That was the wealth. His father had spent his life learning to count the wrong thing and had figured it out too late and had left his son a letter so the son would not make the same mistake. Marcus, standing at the back of a crowded church, decided he would not. he kept the diner coffee cup. It sat on the great glass desk on the 41st floor, a cheap paper cup with a plastic lid. Absurd among the awards and the contracts and the city spread out below, and people who came into his office looked at it and did not ask, because there are some things on a rich man's desk you do not ask about. It changed how he ran everything, though he started a foundation, and he did not name it after himself or after his father. He named it the Pearl Fund, and its single purpose was to find the people the system had let slip through, the old and the poor, with no one to track them, and to make sure they did not finish their lives in a shared room 90 miles from anyone who knew their name. In the first year, it found and helped more than 400 of them. Renee Coleman ran it. She said it was the only job she had ever had that felt like the opposite of her old one, which had been finding people too late. Marcus changed too, in the ways that are hard to see and impossible to fake. He learned his employees' names, all of them, the ones who cleaned the offices at night, the same as the ones who closed the deals. He found out which of them were carrying something heavy quietly, the way his father once had, and more than once an envelope appeared on a desk with no name on it, the way a bowl of soup had once appeared in front of a young man who had not ordered it, and he never claimed it, because he had finally understood the thing his father took. 40 years to learn, and almost did not learn at all, which is that the kindness that counts is the kind that asks for nothing back. He married a few years later a woman who had known him before and after and could tell the difference, and when their first child was born, a daughter, they named her Dorothy. And he told her the story when she was old enough, the whole story, the hardware store and the winter, and the $312 and the woman who would not let his grandfather give up, so that the debt his father could not pay, and that Dorothy had said was never a debt at all, would go on being remembered, which is the only way any of it lasts. Sometimes, late, he still took the letter out of the drawer where he kept it, now his own desk drawer, and read his father's hard, square handwriting, and the man who had been a stranger to him for 36 years felt closer in death than he ever had in life. He understood at last that his father had loved him the only way fear had left him able to, and that the cold he grew up in was not the absence of love, but love clenched into a fist. Around a terror Walter could never speak. The letter had not given Marcus his childhood back. Nothing could. It had given him his father, though. Finally, the true one, the frightened young man in the back of a failing store, saved by a stranger. And that was enough. That was more than enough. And on the quiet nights he would fold the pages along their white creases and put them away and sit for a while in the dark, with the cheap paper cup catching the light from the city below. He kept the cup until it fell apart, and then he had it framed, and it hung on the wall where the awards used to be. The awards he put in a box. He had decided they were counting the wrong thing, and if you had walked into that office on the 41st floor, past the city and the glass and the long view of everything Walter had built, the first thing you would have seen, lit by a small warm light, was a coffee cup from a diner that no longer existed, and beneath it, in a frame, a single yellowed page that began, "If you are reading this, then I am gone," and the last thing it would have told you, if you read all the way to the bottom, was that a debt unpaid is a kind of theft, and that this one, at long last, after 40 years, and one death and one letter and one drive across the city to a room by a parking lot, had finally, fully been paid.